Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. The following conversation was part of Fodi Digital, an online series with leading thinkers and experts on today's dangerous realities. Because this audio is taken from a digital video format, quality is of a lower fidelity than we usually present. Edward Snowden has been condemned both as a traitor and celebrated as a patriot. In this conversation with ethicist Simon Longstaff, he asks us to consider that we have more to fear from our own governments than from any external threat. Governments are now armed with technology that enables them to pry into every aspect of our lives, all in the name of security. Please enjoy Edward Snowden with Surveillance States.
I'm Simon Longstaff, Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, and we're coming to you live from the centre here in Sydney, Australia, where we're joined by a small physically distanced audience and a very large audience that's online. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the custodians of the land where we meet, and to pay honour to their elders past and present, and to all of the elders of Indigenous people on the lands where we gather. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our supporters, and in particular Simon and Katrina Mordaunt, who inspired this particular session. I would like to say that today's session is going to be on the topic of surveillance states, and it's with Edward Snowden. And we're looking at the impact of surveillance on society, where so often surveillance is increased in the name of security. And a number of questions we want to touch on. For example, do we have more to fear from our own governments than we do from external threats? And on those liberties that we've lost, are they ever to be reclaimed? But imagine this. Imagine you're just the latest in a long line of family members who have faithfully served your country, and you find yourself quite inadvertently realising that you are betraying many of the ideals that you have sought to defend. That was the circumstance that faced our guest tonight, Edward Snowden. And he's going to speak for about 20 minutes about what he did when faced with that particular dilemma. And then we'll throw it open for a conversation. And if you have a question, you can put it into the chat box and we'll try to get to as many of those as is possible. Edward Snowden was born in Elizabeth City in North Carolina in the United States. He grew up in the shadow of Fort Meade. He's a systems engineer by training, but amongst other things, he's been an officer with the Central Intelligence Agency and also a contractor with the National Security Agency. The most important part of his story that most of us know, of course, now was this fundamental decision that he had to make, where he was then labelled in the minds of some as a traitor and in others a patriot and a hero. Of course, for the things that he then did, the revelations that he made about US activity and its secrets, he's received numerous awards for the public service he gave, including the Right Livelihood Award, the German Whistleblower Prize, the Ridenour Prize for Truth-Telling, the Karl von Ossietzky Medal from the International League of Human Rights, and currently he's serving as President of the Board of Directors of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. You can tag away at any time with hashtag Fodi, but now joining us live from the internet, please welcome Edward Snowden.
Thank you very much. It's so good to be with you tonight. If I begin just with the remarks, as you stated, I'll try to keep them short because I think people have so many questions. But when we talk about this topic of surveillance states, I think we have to begin with the world today. And when you look around, when you read the headlines, when you listen to the news, when you have a conversation with a friend, when you interact with your devices, open your computer, turn on your phone, everything that you see gives some indication of change, I think. We are in an unprecedented time. And I think the reason for this is we see a change in the allocation of public and political power. By this, I mean we see an increasing concentration of power in private hands. And by that, I don't mean in the context that we would think of as private citizens, but rather institutions that are opaque to the public. We used to have this idea of private citizens and public officials, right? We knew everything about them. They were in the newspapers. They were accountable and answerable to us. And yet they knew nothing about us because we had relatively little power. There was always this idea, promised, I think, by the idea of a representative democratic government, that the people who wield the most power in society would be held to the highest standard of behavior. And the most ordinary among us who hold very little power, we were held to the same account of the same laws, but we were scrutinized less closely because our influence was equivalently reduced. But it doesn't really feel like that anymore, does it? Increasingly, it seems that public officials and the powerful are held to a lower standard of behavior than everyone else. If you did half of what they did, you'd be in jail by the end of the day. And we know less about their goings and comings until we read about them in the newspaper, whether it's 5 months later, whether it's 5 years later, there's always a huge delay. And yet, as soon as we click on a link on the internet, we know that record is being created. It's being stored, it's being shared, it's being passed around, whether it's to Facebook or whether it's to ASIO. I think what this represents is that governments have come to believe that liberty is a dangerous idea. In a way, they're not wrong, because what is liberty? Liberty is freedom from permission. It is the right to think and do and be as you will, free from prejudice and prior restraint. And it is the foundation of all free societies. Now, it is true that, like all good things in life, liberty can be abused. But I think what we lose in this is what governments have forgotten is that the dangers of narrowing our commitment to liberty, to this concept of a free and open society, which we should be clear is exactly what is being experimented with today on issues from policing and terrorism, from COVID tracking to digital surveillance, to freedom of speech and curbs on what the media can investigate and report. These experiments are a far greater threat to our societies than the risks that they seek to mitigate. In fact, the dangers of these sorts of illiberalism are existential threats rather than relative threats, like criminal actions such as terrorism. Terrorism cannot erase Australia or the United States from the map. But the rise of this creeping authoritarianism, the shift from a liberal society to a totalitarian one, truly can. It can change our politics, it can change our name, it can change our character. Think about it. Where would science be if every experiment had to be first run by the church? Where would our politics be if every movement had to be approved by the party in power? And what would our public understanding of that party and its policies look like if every story in an investigation by the newspapers needed to be authorized by national security agencies, which we used to call more plainly, and I think accurately, simply spies? And yet this kind of world is exactly what is being built. And it all begins from the invention of a quantified, permissioned society. I mean by this merely something that we already have, a system in which the places you go, the things that you read and you buy, and the people that you know and love are all known or easily can be known and then recorded. It means that no matter how innocent, the actions of every person in every place are constantly padding out invisibly their own permanent record, this secret history of the soul that is waiting to be analyzed and judged, used and abused. This is what we used to call the surveillance state, and it is, in my opinion, the world of today. Now, take a minute to recall this introduction, and the only reason that we know about this, the fact that we know mass surveillance is not some science fiction story, but is in fact the practical reality today. And the only reason that we can have this conversation today is because someone, somewhere, dared to break the law. That one faraway individual whose name you had never heard of was willing to take it upon themselves to exercise that inherent God-given liberty on which we began this conversation, to question something very dangerous, the distance between what the public was allowed to know by its government and what it needed to know in order to exercise democratic control of that government. And it is reasonable to say that that was a dangerous idea, but I think history has shown that it was also a correct one, and I'm sure we'll examine that in the questions that follow. But since that moment, 7 years ago, discussion of surveillance and secrecy have swept across every country. They have occurred in every language and continue today everywhere that you look. And although we have not yet discovered a solution to the construction and abuse of our growing surveillance states, we have, I think, identified the problem. And the problem is that mass surveillance of the human population is not and never was about safety. It's about power. It was indeed sold to us as about safety, the protection of our lives and livelihoods. But if you look at the record of its application by both corporations and governments, we can see now quite clearly that its most common application is in fact influence and the control of our decisions, from the kind of shoes that you like to the political parties that you vote for. By making you knowable, surveillance aims to make you predictable. And by pairing that predictability with some means of intervention, from the perfectly timed advertisement in your browser window to a pair of boots on the corner at a political rally, it aims to make you directable. This is quite simply a system that is designed to counter the threat of a people at liberty. And that, my friends, is the most dangerous idea in the world. The question before us now, I think, is what are we going to do about it? And with that, let's go to Simon.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Ed, for most of human history, we've lived in small bands, in small villages and towns, where pretty much everything we did was known by those who were around us and by those who were in power and who controlled our lives. Given that's been the history of humans for so many millennia, how do you see the current situation as being fundamentally different to that?
Distance is one, depth is another. When you look at this idea that everything was known about us because we lived in villages, it's not quite accurate. Known by whom and how? It is true that your family, that your neighbors, that people that you were willing to reveal yourself to, that you were close to, that you engaged with, they did know an awful lot about you. But there was also an ephemerality to that knowledge, by which I mean there was no concrete record being padded out. There was no permanence to the fact that were known about you. You could change. You could make mistakes. You could even do terrible things and be forgiven for them because the knowledge of you was personal. It was local. It was human. What has changed is the knowledge about us has become impersonal and inhuman. It is now systems that are tracking and monitoring us that are far away. It is a server in California that knows everything that you have ever typed into that Google search box. And that will never be forgotten. That will never be erased. that will be shared, that will be sold, that will be used, that will be, you will be answerable in a real way to people that you do not know, that have no connection to you. In a way that is, I think, distinctly novel. And the true danger of this idea of a permanent record, in the United States, when you're in school as a kid, the teachers, if you would misbehave, they would always say, you have to take this seriously. You need to get good grades. You need to do your homework. You need to show up on time because this will all go down on your permanent record. And that was only half true. There was no meaningful thing besides your grade average, maybe. But now we very much do have a permanent record that's held by many groups, many companies, many states, in many hands. And we don't, in a real way, influence what does and does not go down on it. And we cannot control the way that it is used. That is, I think, very different than the old world where, let's say you had quite a reputation in some village somewhere. If you moved to the other side of Australia, not to mention across borders, you could start over. You could learn from your mistakes. You could be forgiven and forgotten and become someone new.
And in that situation, one of the stories that's been put out by governments around the world is that they're not really interested in things that truly matter, that they're only looking at metadata, and then they use the analogy of the difference between what's on the front of an envelope and its addressing as opposed to the content of the letter. I get the sense that metadata tells far more information than that's implied in the way that ministers and others talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, the contradiction here is plain because if metadata was so harmless, if metadata was so useless, if metadata should be entitled to a lesser standard of protection, why are governments so interested in it? And the answer, of course, is for an analyst, for me working at the NSA, and for all the computers, especially that process this data, metadata is, in fact, more useful and much more intrusive in a majority of cases, not all cases, but a majority of cases, than the content of communications. So to explain that first, we need to step back and answer, well, what is metadata, right? As you say, there's this common description between what's in an envelope and what's on an envelope. I think a better representation of metadata is, or description of metadata is simply activity records, because we're not talking about envelopes anymore. We're talking about the movement of your phones, and we're talking about the communications between devices and devices. We're talking about the creation of records that you don't really recognize even exist, which is a very different thing than knowingly addressing an envelope and knowingly handing it over to a postal carrier to have it delivered to someone who, again, will receive this and read this and open this and everything else. Metadata plainly means activity records. Metadata is, the government calls it data about data, but what this means is rather than knowing what you say on the phone or what you say in a cafe, having an investigator follow you into that cafe, know that you're in this cafe, see who you meet with, see how long you were in there, but they can't sit in the booth with you because they don't want to draw suspicion. They may drive on the street behind you, but at a distance. They see the plate number on your car. They see where it goes. They see where you wake up. They see where you go to sleep. They see who wakes up and goes to sleep with you. All of these things can be inferred from computer to computer records, which legally would be handled as metadata, contextualized as metadata. None of that requires knowing a word that you said in the restaurant, a word that was said inside the walls of that home or that hotel room, and yet the story of your life is still made plain by this. When you pick up the phone, when you make a call, who you were calling, how long you were on the phone, what time of night that was after you had just called a hospital or a crisis center or an ex. All of these things tell a story without knowing these things. And in fact, metadata is very small. It's very friendly and understandable to machines. in a way that content is very complex and only really understandable to humans. If you want to think about metadata, think about perfect records of private lives that are knowable, understandable, analyzable by machines, and you're very close to the story.
Okay, so that tells us something of the tools available, and your dangerous idea is that there is a rising tide of totalitarianism. It's not just in states that we might expect to have those sorts of police, but even the liberal democracies are embracing this mechanism because they are afraid of the liberty of their own citizens and seek to suppress it in some senses under the cloud or the cloak of security. It's a pretty dark picture, but I happen to think that you seem to be an optimist about our ability to respond to this. You think that it can be reversed, if not overnight, then incrementally. But the point is that if that's to be true, then people are going to have to exercise a fair amount of moral courage to withstand that. And I want to ask you, based on your own experience and the experience of people like Julian Assange, do you think we're obliged to be brave in that way and to take the costs someone like you have had to bear as part of the price of that liberty?
Well, I think it's more a question of what kind of world we want. I struggled with the decision to come forward in 2013. I very much did not want to do this because I knew it meant the end of my life, as comfortable as it was. I lived in Hawaii, which is one of the closest places to paradise that we have in the world, with the woman that I loved and had been with for many years. I made a very high salary to do very little work. And the only thing that I had to do was keep my mouth shut and keep spying on people in my country and around the world. But then I thought about, if I continued to do that, knowing that this system exists, knowing that the laws, as loose and permissive as they were in the United States, were being broken, and more fundamentally, the rights of people in my country and around the world were being violated. What would the next year look like? If the public didn't know this was happening, and the government could gain another mile in terms of entrenching these authorities, expanding these systems, and what would the next year look like, and the next year look like, and what kind of world do we want to live in? What does the future look like if we do nothing? If we recognize that acting has some risk, which is absolutely essentially true, or requires some sacrifice, and we simply wait for someone else to do it. Well, I had been waiting for years for someone else to do it. And every other whistleblower in the U.S. intelligence services that you look at had been doing the same thing. This context, this concept of a whistleblower, someone who is reporting, revealing wrongdoing or abuse, or even simply questionable activity in their institution, wherever that may be, this is a very rare occurrence, which prompts the question, well, why? And I think the answer that everyone understands inherently is there is retaliation. Some truths are uncomfortable. Those in power who have evaded responsibility and are benefiting from their misbehavior very much will not be excited to suddenly have to answer for that. But again, there's the question of, all right, well, if we do nothing, what happens? And I think this is one of the things. In your introduction, you mentioned many people have called me a hero. And I have actively tried to fight against that label. And it's not just because, I'm trying to tamp down hero worship of me as a person, but the idea of hero worship generally. By calling someone a hero, you distance yourself from them. You go, they did something that I never did. They are a different type of person. They're a different class, a different category. They are extraordinary, and I am ordinary. But look at me, right? I'm the IT guy. I'm the guy that manages the network. I am ordinary. And every person in every part of history who has done something extraordinary has themselves been ordinary too. There are no heroic people. there are only heroic decisions. And you are never further than one moment away from making one yourself. And I think it's important that we remember that.
Maybe heroism is in just falling on the right side of each question, just a little bit, rather than it always having to be the grand gesture. I wonder, have you thought about the people who pursued you? And do you have any sympathy for them, the people who felt obliged by the law, even if they thought it was an unjust law, to pursue you for what you did, or who felt that sacrificing you was a lesser evil than some other good that they could protect, like national security? Have you had much time to think about what would have been the case if you were in their shoes?
This is a really interesting question, one that I haven't gotten before. I'd say I understand them. One of the most interesting things about my story, you mentioned at the beginning, this idea that I had to betray certain ideals of my federal family. And that's in fact not true. But it seems true. Reflexively, we would think it's true. My father worked for the military for his whole life. My grandfather worked for the military. My mother worked for the court systems, in fact, still does, the same courts that are trying to jail me. And I worked side to side, elbow to elbow, with everybody else who is now, among other things, hunting me. So I do understand that. What is interesting is the reason people think that I committed some sort of betrayal is a popular myth propagated by those responsible for the abuses that I, with the assistance of journalists, helped uncover. I didn't publish any documents. I entrusted them to the press. And the idea here is that we are told there's an oath of secrecy. It's the most important thing that an intelligence officer does. It says, they're not going to talk to anybody about what they do. And at least in the United States, at least at the CIA, there is no oath of secrecy. There is an oath of service that you take on your very first day entering on duty. It says, I swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, our founding law, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I took this very seriously. There is a secrecy obligation, a secrecy agreement that you sign. This is a civil agreement, a contract that says you won't talk to people, blah, blah, blah. And there are laws intended to enforce this and impose some criminal liability for it. But this is where ethically things get interesting, and why I understand this feeling of being pulled by these people at the NSA who are told, you have to go after this whistleblower. And they signed up, to go after terrorists, and going, what is the distinction between espionage as charged by the government, which conjures images of this person stealing secrets and selling them to a foreign government, and instead someone inside the government, a citizen, just like you, gathering evidence of unlawful behavior or abusive behavior, and then sharing it publicly with journalists for no private benefit, in fact, tremendous private harm, but great public benefit. And we have to ask ourselves in this context, what do you do when your obligations are in tension? You have on the one side your oath of service to the Constitution, and on the other side, your secrecy agreement with an agency that itself is breaking the law. And there is this idea, at least how I sort of resolved this myself, between inferior and superior obligations. I think most would agree that your fidelity to the people of your country is always higher than your obligations to your employer.
I take it that if there had been an oath of secrecy rather than an agreement to maintain secrets that matched, if you like, your oath of service, that you still would have preferred the duty you see to the people and the Constitution rather than to the government or that oath. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, when you look at it, the phraseology of it, using oath versus agreement, using civil contracts versus whatever. Ultimately, we're all talking rhetoric on a fundamental level, but oath does imply some solemnity. If in the darkened room at the CIA I had been swearing oaths to secrecy instead of to the flag, emotionally I think it would have been harder for me. But when we think about it ethically, it still does boil down to the same fundamental question. What do you owe a greater loyalty to? Do you owe it to humanity? Do you owe it to your people, right? Or do you owe it to an employer, an agency, even a state, right?
You mentioned
when we
there,
go ahead.
Ed, you mentioned the fact that there's this very radical asymmetry now between the way in which the rich and powerful seem to be able to act with complete impunity, whereas the ordinary person at the slightest infraction is likely to be called to account, in part because of these surveillance arrangements. When I think about that and listen to some of the things you say, I wonder if that's another very dangerous idea in itself, that the rich and powerful, including corporations, ought to be held to account. And whether you see that there's any possibility of that actually coming to be.
Well, see, what we're seeing is the result of a decline in the rule of law, or rather the equality of application of the rule of law. When I say we need people in the high offices to be held to a higher standard of behavior, do we mean this legally? Like, does this need to be strictly in the law? It says, if you're a governor and you commit this crime, you should suffer a higher penalty. Reasonably, that could be argued to be a good thing, but I think it's simpler than that. When we believe in rule of law, we believe everybody should be held to the same standard of behavior. And yet what has happened as the result of at least public understanding, public awareness of the current state of play, which realistically is probably quite equivalent to the historic norm. It's just we didn't know all of the abuses that were happening. We didn't know all the ways the rich and powerful were getting away with it because fewer people had access to the power of broadcast and the way the internet has changed that. But what we've seen is it's not that the least among us are held to a different legal standard of behavior. It's not that they have higher penalties. It's that the laws as written are not applied to the people in power, whereas they are strictly applied to the people with no power. And so rather, those who benefit the most from our system are bound the least by it. And I think what we need to see to handle this, one of the ways you can think about sort of ameliorating this without creating two-tiered system of law, which is really the practical outcome that we have been trying to avoid. We want everyone held to the same standard of behavior, is perhaps something like mandatory prosecutions or investigations for those who are alleged to have committed abuses of power of simply the same laws that ordinary people would be held to. And then there is another issue, which is there are opportunities for exploitation and abuse of people, small and large, and populations, small and large, by those at the heads of institutions and offices, corporate and governmental, that are not available to ordinary people. And because there are so few of these people, there are no legal prohibitions against this. And because the rich and powerful, of course, in every system in the world, have more influence over the production and passage of laws, it's very unlikely that these laws will be passed. So I think the fundamental question here is simply, how do we end impunity amongst the powerful, right? And this is not necessarily about passing new laws to hold these people to new standards of behavior, but simply making sure they are held at least to the account of our laws as they're already written, which we already know in many cases, or at least have strong grounds to suspect, are and have been broken by them.
I suspect that a lot of the political turmoil in countries like the United States and Australia is driven by this sense of there being two different systems. The law does eventually deliver in some cases. I think it was the 9th District Circuit Court Appeals Court. Yeah, well, for you, they found that although the program ended some time ago, the one that you exposed was, and I presume according to law, always was illegal. Have you taken some comfort from the fact that the courts have actually reached the conclusion that you did?
I have. For those of us in the audience who are less familiar with this, just weeks ago, the U.S. 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, this is a federal court, not at the initial level, it's at the higher level, issued a decision, and this is not by a single judge, this is by a panel of judges, that the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program that was basically collecting phone records of everyone in the United States every day, who they were calling. It's exactly the metadata that's so controversial in Australia today, although a much lighter and frankly less intrusive version than what we see in Australia, the way it's being applied to the internet today. Anybody who was a customer of a major telecommunications firm was having their records delivered to the state security agencies, basically. Regardless of any suspicion of criminality or innocence, it just happened as a matter of rote under the theory that all phone records were relevant to a terrorism investigation, to any terrorism investigation. Investigation hadn't even happened yet. But in order to investigate any foreseeable crime, they needed to have the records of everyone everywhere. Now, this fell into conflict with the Fourth Amendment of the United States, which is our basic right to privacy, that says you can't be monitored basically without going to the court, making a showing of probable cause to suspect someone of wrongdoing, and then the judge either approves or rejects this request and goes, all right, you can violate the right to privacy because you have grounds for it. Instead, they simply went, we're going to monitor everyone everywhere because now, for the first time, we have technology that means we can. The court did not rule that it was unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment, although they plainly believed that. They said it was likely unconstitutional. They did say it was unlawful, and always had been, which is in a real way a vindication, because this is exactly the argument that I made when I came forward 7 years ago and said this. This is also not the first federal court in the United States, even the first federal court in the United States, to make this kind of ruling. The same thing happened in December of 2013, which is the very reason that then President of the United States, Barack Obama, came out a month later and abandoned this program, said he wanted to end it. The appeals court that followed the month later basically affirmed this kind of judgment and said it was likely unconstitutional. But this is the fundamental quandary. The courts are slow, right? We're looking at 6 months after this came forward to make the first ruling, 7 years later to make a final ruling. Many of these cases go on for decades before they're simply flushed from the court for lack of evidence, even though the courts sincerely believe and are willing to write that they believe there are constitutional issues in play here, that the government is not just potentially violating laws, but very likely violating rights. This idea that justice delayed is justice denied, how do we reconcile the public's need and the fact that there are no penalties for a government or an official that breaks the law, even when this happens? One of the most interesting things about this ruling, right, is, okay, they say, and the court actually cited me by name, which was a rather remarkable thing, given that the same courts federally are saying that I should go to prison for the rest of my life. They're going, okay, he revealed this, it's unlawful, great thing. Why do we not see officials, right, now having to answer to courts themselves, make defenses themselves for why they did this, why they violated law? The reality is the laws that bind governments, both in the United States, Australia, around the world, it's a very common feature of legislation and law, particularly when it comes to security services, that there are criminal penalties for individual violations of these wiretapping laws by private citizens, right? Like if you hacked someone's email or intercepted their phone calls and shared them, wrote reports on them, published them in the newspaper or whatever, you'd go to prison for a decade. but an official does it, even if they violate the law, even on a grand scale, millions of times, billions of times, or in this case, trillions of times, there is no penalty. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and in fact, often the legislation specifically exempts them from the application of what would otherwise be the criminal law. We were talking earlier on today, and I mentioned that there's a piece of legislation currently before the Australian Parliament, the ASIO Amendment Bill, which seeks to extend the powers of ASIO in a range of different ways. Oh, yes, there's a... Right, okay, so you've picked up on this.
Yeah, there's a bill that's being debated.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to tell us
But what was really interesting
this.
about it, when I mentioned this, you made a connection between the introduction of this bill and what you thought might be the reason behind Australian government's apparent lack of support for Julian Assange, who's currently facing extradition proceedings in the United Kingdom, initiated by the government of the United States. And there's a whole lot of things around this. I'd be interested to know what you thought that connection might be as to why our government has been so reluctant. But also, I know that you make a distinction about what, say, you did and what Assange did, and the implications for the press more generally, should Assange be extradited and subsequently convicted in the United States as a publisher rather than as a whistleblower.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of distinctions, but I think, well, first, the legal distinction. I think the ASIO law, as bad as it is in Australia where they are, it is really meaningfully, I think, narrowing public rights and trying to, again, limit the very loose restrictions that are already placed on intelligence services on Australia. There is a second legal effort by the Australian government that I think Australians are far more familiar with than I am, which is limitations on press freedoms and reporting. Years ago, I was giving talks in Australia about a new kind of crisis where a Guardian reporter had their records taken to try to identify their source by the Australian Federal Police. We've seen just in the last years that Australia is dropping down in press freedom rankings because of the Annika Smethurst case, and where we see press rooms being raided, we see witnesses being intimidated, we see documents being taken and destroyed. Basically, the government is trying to decide and trying to actually normalize the idea that state security agencies decide the things that can and cannot be said in the press, and through that, the things that cannot be said in society. And this is fundamentally a dangerous thing because, these intelligence services, they like to call themselves intelligence services. They like to call themselves national security agencies. They don't like to call themselves state security agencies because it reminds us of their origin. But what does national security actually mean to these intelligence agencies, particularly given that Australia, while it does suffer from terrorism, just like every other country on the planet, terrorism is a crime. Again, it is not an existential threat. It is not something that requires or has any history of being effectively resolved by military force. What we have is agencies that see, what does state security mean? What does national security mean? It is the stability of the system of rule in a society. Intelligence agencies in basically every country, they don't report to the legislature. They don't report to the judiciary. They report to the executive. They are directed by whatever party or president is in power at the time, the prime minister, the home secretary. And their priorities are changed constantly in response to this political directive. And this is what we see, I think, in the reluctance of Australia to defend Julian Assange, an Australian citizen who has not lived meaningfully or worked meaningfully in the United States. I believe probably traveled only there, maybe for press conferences, decades ago. Julian Assange is being prosecuted for the best work WikiLeaks ever did. Assange is controversialized, and WikiLeaks is controversialized for recent stories in like 2016 about the election, But none of those stories in recent history, 2016 on, have anything to do with the case today. They are about 2009, 2010 era revelations of U.S. war crimes, torture reports, killings that had gone unreported. And WikiLeaks won awards for this in basically every country in the world. Every newspaper in the world ran them. The stories were run in Australia, they were run in Britain, they were run in the United States. And that is what he's being tried for today. And I believe the reason the Australian government is so reluctant to defend this man, who very much actually needs the defense, because if he's convicted under this legal theory, every other journalist in the world can be prosecuted for espionage, no matter what you think about Assange. They're not doing it because the Australian government is waging its own war on the press. And they are trying to insert more curbs on the press in precisely the way the Trump administration is doing in the case of Julian Assange right now. Remember, the Obama administration looked at exactly this case against Assange because it happened so long ago, and they declined to bring it. It was only now under the Trump administration that they feel comfortable doing this. The second thing you asked was the distinction between myself and Assange. It's actually quite interesting because I think Assange enjoys, sadly, a lot less public support than I do. And that's because his politics are much more controversial. But his work is as a publisher. Even in the best examples, right? In the United States, there has always been a kind of unwritten rule, a bargain between the government and the press, that they would harshly prosecute the sources of journalism that they didn't like, national security stories, right, reporting classified abuses, such as in my case. I was the source of documents that then went to the Washington Post, to the Guardian, Der Spiegel, and so on. And so they prosecuted me. They did not prosecute any reporters. They did not prosecute any publishers. In the Assange case, the United States government is specifically targeting Julian Assange not as the source of any of these stories, but as the publisher of them. And this is under the Espionage Act, the same charge they're using against me that they have used against every national security whistleblower in the history of the United States, basically going back to Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers in the 1970s, the Pentagon Papers being the secret history of the war, and the government's secret understanding that it was not a winnable war, and yet they prolonged the war and so on and so forth, the publication of which shortened the length of the war.
I
But
think,
in all
Ed,
these cases, they charge the sources, not the publishers, and now that is changing.
yeah, and I think it's interesting that the US government in its own submissions before the court have said that there has been no one harmed in relation to the material that Assange published. Let's move on a bit, because, I mean, clearly, I don't think you're going to argue that there are no circumstances where surveillance should apply and that should be total abolition of this system. And we had one early question from somebody asking about COVID-19 and the fact that there have been a number of tracing apps put in. A large number of Australians have not taken it up, but they're wondering about whether or not there are genuine cases of public health and safety in a time like this where it is actually reasonable to expect people, for the common good, to give up some of their privacy for their own health and for the health of others.
Well, I mean, this is a very difficult question, but it reminds me of the case of 9/11 in the United States and all of the bad laws that came as a result of it, all the bad policies that came as a result of it. We had a legitimate threat that faced the United States. Al-Qaeda had demonstrated a strong organizational capability to perform terrorist attacks, not out in the Middle East somewhere, but in the United States. 3,000 people died as a result of that, which is a staggering number in the history of terrorist attacks. And yet our response to it was not to create new law enforcement coalitions. And remember, the United States had the sympathy of the world at this moment. The United States could have completely reshaped the way international investigations were handled, the way international jurisdictions were handled in terrorism cases. and even the permissiveness required or assent required by governments before these investigations happen. But they didn't do that. Instead, they went for a unilateral approach. Instead, we went to war. And more than 1 million people have died as a result of that. And we're still in it. There's no end in sight. The rights of everyone in the United States and around the world were diminished as a result of the United States abandoning its traditional commitment to some fundamental basic rights with the passage of something called the Patriot Act, which was really close to the original sin in the production of this, or the construction of this modern system of mass surveillance that we're dealing with today. Now, how does this relate to the coronavirus? Well, when we think about contact tracing and we think about the epidemiology and we look at public health officials and how they deal with this, they make strong arguments that there are cases where contact tracing is useful. And I think we can be persuaded by that in many cases. However, there has not been a convincing case that contact tracing is useful in ending the coronavirus pandemic, particularly the mass scale where they're watching everyone in the world, because we've seen country after country try this and country after country fail to resolve it. Now, there are different ways of doing contact tracing. Australia has embraced one of the worst methods, the most intrusive methods of doing this, where they release an app that basically just turns all the sensors on your phone and then reports all of this information to central authorities without your knowledge and really meaningful control over. In other proposals, ones that we've seen from tech giants like Apple and Google, they work on similar principles. They turn radios on in your phone that emit temporary identifiers that aren't connectable to you as an individual. They're just random numbers. They're used for a period and then they're used again. And every phone around you is also emitting a similar identifier. And you basically just make a list of all these random numbers that you've heard. But your device does not upload these to anyone with your identity, with anything like that. It doesn't go to a central server unless you are diagnosed with the coronavirus. You go to the hospital, the doctor asks you, are you running this app? You go, I am. And they ask you, do you want to upload this information to a central or actually a decentralized database around the world of all these different servers? Because the only thing that you're uploading are random numbers that other phones generated themselves to identify themselves and then not use again. And then everybody around the world can once a day, once a week, whatever, 2 times a day, it's completely arbitrary. You could choose the upload time. Download this list of random numbers for a region. Go, all the people in Sydney who have gotten coronavirus this week, here's the numbers. And then your phone, without contacting the government, without revealing yourself to anyone, goes, am I on this list? And if you are, it warns you. And then you too are given an opportunity to upload this. And ideally, in a better world, this would give you priority access to testing and treatment. So there is some incentive for the individual to share this information, to get themselves help. Because if we go right now, even with the best of this technology, which, by the way, these ideal circumstances that we're talking about, there is no meaningful technical evidence that it actually works.
I take it that what you've been saying is that, yes, public health matters and these other things too. It's just that we jump too quickly to easy and dangerous solutions rather than the ones that you've just been talking about, which have been demonstrating other ways which can secure the public good without the loss of the privacy. We've got a number of people who've been asking a range of questions, which I sort of almost got to before, and they're wondering about, this is more at the personal level, about what this all has meant for your family and whether you actually feel that the sacrifice you personally had to make and your family and loved ones and all the rest was worth it, given what you've seen in terms of the results of your actions.
When I came forward, I thought that I would never see my family again. The likeliest outcome was that I would end up in a orange jumpsuit in a supermax prison or, a prison ship out in the Indian Ocean. No one would ever hear from me again. The idea that I would be able to speak with you today would really have been seen as fantastic and naive. Um, and yet, since then, I've been able to talk to audiences around the world. I've been able to see my family again in person multiple times. The woman that I loved, the girlfriend that I mentioned earlier in Hawaii, is now my wife, who's in the other room. And I've got to say, I was the worst boyfriend in the world because I couldn't tell her what I was doing, because if she had known, the government could have charged her as an accessory to the crime, even if they didn't believe that she actually meaningfully was, simply as leverage over me. So none of them knew. And yet, in the years that have passed, I've been able to enjoy the support and love of all of them. And that's a debt I'll never be able to repay.
Do you think there are a few practical things that people could take on board as things they could do to try and ameliorate the worst of the surveillance state, or whatever a bad actor might do?
I mean, there's many things here, and there's detailed in much greater length online if you just look for privacy guides from non-governmental organizations. Don't look at the for-profit vendors. But the basic ideas here are, when you think about the surveillance as it happened so many years ago in 2013, this might be a slide that people remember. This was actually a top secret classified document. And it shows prominently at the top of it some of the largest names in the internet and the dates at which they began collaborating with the NSA through the FBI, far beyond what was legally required of them. This is especially interesting to a non-American audience, such as Australians, because for an American, they needed to get a warrant to get your information from these companies. That's everything you ever had on Facebook, everything you ever clicked, everything you ever looked at, how long you did, where your device was, where it connected from, again, everything you ever typed into that magic Google search box. But for those who are not U.S. citizens, no warrant was required. They didn't have to go to a judge. Instead, they went to a secret surveillance court once a year to get authorizations to monitor anyone who belonged to large categories of behavior, general means for surveilling someone or getting these things from these internet services, such as you had information returned relevant to foreign intelligence, which is basically everything if you're not an American citizen. And so, the primary thing here is think about what these companies know about you. Do you need to have your whole life on a private cloud? Do you need to expose yourself to this level? Beyond that, ads are one of the primary ways you attract. The whole point of that slide was the government would get incredibly rich information, not through their own unilateral super secret spying program, but simply holding these companies upside down by the ankles and shaking them until all the data fell out, right? Ad blockers, it sounds simple.
Do you think that Google and Facebook and people like that should actually implement end-to-end encryption, not just to stop governments and others getting access to the data, but even so that they can't get to it? In other words, they should act against what they might see their commercial interest and at least secure this in some way to put a halt to what's just been described, which I imagine if you add AI into the mixture is going to become even more extraordinary in terms of its capacity to monitor our lives.
Certainly. For the folks at home, end-to-end encryption. Encryption in general is just protecting a communication as it transits the internet, old secret writing where you wrote in code on a letter and then mailed it and used a cipher. All of that happens today routinely as you use the internet. When you buy something online, you're using encrypted communications, even if you don't know it. That's the little lock icon on your address bar. End-to-end encryption is an improvement on that system. Where today, for example, when you send a message to someone through like a Facebook Messenger, you have a copy of that message on your phone. Your friend has a copy of that message on their phone. But Facebook also has its own copy of it that they can read and then they can turn over and do all of these things. End-to-end encryption means Facebook has a copy of the message, but one that it cannot read because it doesn't have the key, right? It doesn't have the answer to that cipher that would unlock the message. It just holds the garbled message for you and your friend that you two have the keys to unlock. So this man in the middle can no longer attack you. Now, in a new way, you can trust Google. You can trust Google to a larger extent than you can today. So this is actually is attractive in many ways to these companies because it allows them to do more things. For example, Apple uses this kind of technology for your medical data, where the key is only on your device rather than on their cloud. But they don't use it for everything. And in fact, most of these companies don't use it for most things. Google, quite famously, doesn't want to make sure that your email box is illegible to them, even though it would be trivial for them to hold all your messages in a way that only you could read them. Because, as you say, they want to look at them and go, oh, you're reading an email about a trip to Thailand. Why don't we show you hotels for this? And as more time goes on,
Ed, unfortunately, the clock's beaten us. I think, I'm just looking at the chat box that's been coming in, and we could go on for a very, very long time. And I know that you've had some famously long sessions where you will chat, sometimes for hours, but that's not our option tonight. Look, I just want to thank Ed. And if you want to know more about Ed and his background, there's a wonderful book, Permanent Record. It gives you that background in terms of the family history plus there you go. Same guy. Thanks, Ed. Beautiful. We didn't even plan that. So I'd encourage you to read it. It's really fantastic, and it gives you insight to the person, their history, and how they came to make a decision such as they did. I'd like to thank you for joining us here in the audience and online. The chat box is going to be open for a while, so if you'd still like to talk about the kinds of ideas that have been floated here, please feel free to do so. Special thanks, as I mentioned before, to Simon and Katrina Morden, who supported and inspired this event. That's what helps to make things like tonight happen. And of course, the next Festival of Dangerous Ideas digital event is in just 2 weeks' time with David Wallace-Wells, who's talking about the uninhabitable Earth. So I hope to see you then. But before we go, I know there's a small group here, and if you're online, if you feel like clapping, please thank Edward Snowden. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. If I could say...
one more thing, before we get cut off.
If I could say just one more thing. First of all, thank you for the wonderful conversation and the even better questions. I try to say this because of the context of the conversation. Everyone forgets it. But so many people look at me in my situation who are sympathetic to me, and they tell me to stay safe. And I remember that changed in the United States after 9/11. Everyone, when they saw each other go away, they would say, hey, stay safe out there. That mentality is what has gotten us into the circumstances of today, the problems that we face. So as I say goodbye tonight, I'd like to say to all of you, don't stay safe, stay free. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Bye.
This session was recorded as part of FODI Digital, presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website. Thank you.